Snow fell heavily on Christmas Eve, burying Clara's career, her savings, and her entire future in one brutal termination. With nowhere to go, she fled to a rotting, inherited cabin in the woods. She sought only shelter from the storm, but instead, she unearthed a terrifying $1 million secret. The sprawling glass windows of Gallagher and Company Wealth Management offered a breathtaking view of the Boston skyline, but Clara Mitchell could only stare at the mahogany desk in front of her. Across that vast expanse of polished wood sat Richard Gregory, the firm's senior partner, his face an impassive mask of corporate ruthlessness. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon on December the 24th. The office holiday party was in full swing 3 floors below, the muffled bass of festive music vibrating through the floorboards. But in this soundproof executive suite, Clara's life was being systematically dismantled. Richard adjusted his gold cuffs and pushed a single, devastating sheet of paper across the desk. Effective immediately, Clara. The internal audit traces the missing offshore allocations directly to your access terminal. We are terminating your employment for gross negligence, though frankly you should consider yourself fortunate. We aren't involving federal authorities. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, her hands trembling as she read the termination notice. Richard, you know I didn't authorize those transfers. Arthur Pendleton gave me the override codes. He told me you personally approved the restructuring of the Cayman accounts. Arthur Pendleton is currently enjoying an early retirement in Monaco, Richard replied smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair. And there is no paper trail linking him or me to those transfers. There is only your digital signature. Security is waiting outside. You have 5 minutes to clear your desk. The injustice of it was a physical weight on her chest. She had been the perfect scapegoat, a brilliant but unconnected junior analyst who had worked 80-hour weeks for 3 years, sacrificing her personal life, her health, and her youth to climb the ladder. Now, she was being thrown off the roof to protect the executives who had gambled away millions of their clients' money. The walk to the elevators, flanked by 2 towering security guards holding her pitiful cardboard box of belongings, was a blur of humiliation. Her colleagues averted their eyes, whispering behind their champagne flutes as she was marched out into the freezing slush of the city streets. By the time Clara reached her apartment, a creeping numbness had settled over her. The situation was catastrophic. Because she had spent the last 2 years quietly paying down the astronomical medical debts left behind by her late mother, Clara had almost nothing in her savings account. The rent on her modest but overpriced city apartment was past due. To make matters worse, she found a bright yellow eviction warning taped to her door. She was 32 years old, disgraced in her industry, broke, and entirely alone. Sitting on her threadbare sofa, still wearing her damp wool coat, Clara dug through a drawer of unpaid bills and old mail until she found a thick, cream-colored envelope. It had arrived months ago from the office of Thomas Abernathy, a small-town estate lawyer. Inside was a tarnished brass key and a property deed. They belonged to a piece of real estate left to her by her eccentric great-aunt Sylvia Pembroke, a woman Clara hadn't seen since childhood. The property was a secluded cottage located deep in the dense, mountainous woods of Oakhaven, Vermont. At the time the letter arrived, Clara had scoffed at the idea of a dilapidated cabin in the middle of nowhere. Now, staring at the brass key, it represented the only roof in the world that she actually owned. Desperation is a powerful motivator. Within 2 hours, Clara had packed her entire life into the trunk of her fading 10-year-old sedan. She drove north on Interstate 89 as the sky darkened into a bruised purple and the snow began to fall with violent intensity. The heater in her car rattled weakly, barely keeping the frost off the windshield. For 5 agonizing hours, she navigated treacherous, unplowed mountain roads, guided only by a crude, hand-drawn map Thomas Abernathy had included in the envelope. It was past midnight when her headlights finally swept across a rusting iron gate choked with dead winter vines. Beyond it sat the Pembroke cottage. It was far worse than she had imagined. The structure was a towering, Gothic-style Victorian cabin that sagged under the weight of decades of neglect. The cedar shingles were rotting, curling upward like dead leaves, and the front porch slumped dangerously to one side. Tall, skeletal pine trees crowded the house, their branches scraping against the cracked upper windows like jagged fingernails. Clara parked the car, her boots sinking knee-deep into the fresh snow. The freezing wind cut right through her coat. She forced the brass key into the swollen wooden front door, throwing her shoulder against it until the hinges shrieked in protest, and the door gave way. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of dry rot, dust, and old paper. She swept her flashlight across the room, illuminating sheets covering the furniture like resting ghosts. The cold inside the house was absolute, a deep, settling chill that felt ancient. With no electricity and no cell service, Clara managed to find a stack of dry, split wood near the massive stone fireplace. Her fingers were stiff and bleeding from the cold by the time she finally coaxed a spark from a box of old matches. As the flames flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the peeling wallpaper, Clara pulled a dusty quilt from the sofa and wrapped herself in it, staring into the fire. She had lost everything. Her reputation was destroyed, her bank accounts were empty, and she was hiding in a condemned ruin. As she listened to the howling wind batter the exterior of the house, Clara closed her eyes, entirely unaware that the floorboards directly beneath her feet were hiding a secret that would soon eclipse every problem she thought she had. Morning broke over the Oakhaven woods with a blinding, harsh glare reflecting off the snowdrifts. Clara awoke shivering, the fire having died down to a bed of grey ash hours ago. Her breath plumed in the freezing air of the living room. As she stood up, her joints ached from sleeping on the hard, dusty sofa. Daylight offered no comfort. It only illuminated the severe decay of her new reality. Water stains mapped the ceilings, the floorboards bowed unevenly under her weight, and cobwebs hung thick in every corner. Her initial plan was born out of sheer survival instinct. She needed capital, and to get it, she needed to sell this property as quickly as possible. Even as a tear down, the acreage alone had to be worth something. But before Thomas Abernathy, or any real estate agent, would even step foot on the premises, she had to make it look less like a haunted house and more like a rustic fixer-upper. Clara found a bucket, some harsh chemical cleaners under the rusted kitchen sink, and a few threadbare rags. She tied her hair back and threw herself into the grueling physical labor, using the sheer exertion to keep the freezing temperatures at bay and to stop her mind from replaying Richard Gregory's smug face. By the afternoon of her third day in the cabin, the heavy snowfall had evolved into a blinding whiteout blizzard, trapping her completely. She moved her cleaning efforts to the back of the house, entering a room that her great-aunt Sylvia had apparently used as a study. It was a strange, suffocating space. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 of the walls, completely packed with rotting, water-damaged encyclopedias, dusty ledgers, and strange, archaic mechanical clocks that had long since stopped ticking. As Clara swept away decades of dust from the heavy oak floorboards, she paused. Something about the room felt fundamentally wrong. Her analytical mind, the same mind that used to identify microscopic discrepancies in massive corporate financial portfolios, began to register the spatial anomalies of the room. The study was situated in the back corner of the house, yet the interior wall seemed at least 4 feet shorter than the exterior wall she had seen from the outside. Furthermore, the floor in this specific room required a slight step up from the hallway. Why would a ground-floor room have a raised foundation? She dismissed it at first as the shoddy architecture of a decaying, century-old cabin. She turned back to the fireplace in the study to stoke the small fire she had built. Grasping a heavy, solid iron fireplace poker, she turned quickly, her frozen fingers slipping. The heavy iron rod plummeted from her grip, striking the oak floorboards with tremendous force. Thud! Clara froze. She stared at the floor. The impact hadn't produced the dull, solid sound of iron hitting wood resting on a foundation. It had echoed. It was a deep, resonant, hollow boom that reverberated up through the soles of her boots. Her heart began to race. She dropped to her knees, brushing the dust away from the spot where the poker had landed. The wooden planks here were different. They were wider, fastened not with the standard iron nails she had seen throughout the rest of the house, but with heavy wooden pegs that had been sanded down to blend in. Clara scrambled down the hall to the small, dilapidated tool shed attached to the kitchen. She rummaged through the rusted gardening tools until she found a heavy steel crowbar. Returning to the study, she wedged the forked end of the crowbar into the microscopic seam between 2 of the wide oak planks. She threw her entire body weight against the heavy steel tool. For a long moment, the ancient wood resisted, groaning in protest. Then, with a loud, violent crack, the peg snapped, and the floorboard lifted. Clara gasped for air, sweat stinging her eyes, despite the freezing temperature of the room. She ripped the plank away, tossing it aside. She wedged the crowbar under the next board, and the next, ripping up a section of the floor with a frantic, manic energy. Beneath the destroyed floorboards was a thick layer of heavy black industrial canvas, caked in decades of dust and mouse droppings. Clara grabbed the corner of the canvas and yanked it back. A choked gasp escaped her lips. Set directly into the recessed subfloor was a massive square trapdoor made of solid, rusted steel. It looked like something salvaged from a maritime freighter. Welded to the center of the steel plate was a thick iron ring, and securing the latch was a heavy, industrial-grade padlock that had been completely seized by rust. Clara stared at it, her chest heaving. Great-Aunt Sylvia was a frail, reclusive woman who supposedly spent her final years knitting and reading. She did not install military-grade steel trapdoors in her study. Clara raised the crowbar high above her head and brought it down on the rusted padlock with all her remaining strength. Sparks flew as steel cracked against steel. She struck it again and again, driven by a cocktail of fear, adrenaline, and desperate curiosity. On the 5th strike, the rusted shackle shattered. She tossed the broken lock aside and gripped the frozen iron ring with both hands. Planting her boots firmly on the edges of the opening, she pulled upward. The trapdoor was incredibly heavy, screeching on unoiled hinges as it reluctantly gave way. A blast of freezing, stale air rushed up from the darkness below, carrying the distinct, metallic scent of copper and old paper. Clara grabbed her flashlight from the desk and clicked it on, angling the beam down into the void. A narrow, spiraling staircase, carved directly into the bedrock, descended deeper than the cabin's standard foundation should have allowed. Gathering her courage, she zipped her coat tightly and stepped down into the darkness. Her boots echoed sharply against the stone. At the bottom of the stairs, the narrow shaft opened up into a wide, concrete-reinforced subterranean room. Clara swung the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the pitch-black air. When the circle of light hit the far wall, She stopped breathing entirely. Built into the solid concrete was a gleaming, pristine, stainless steel bank vault door. It stood 7 feet tall, completely untouched by the rust and decay of the house above it. In the center of the massive door was a complex, multi-tiered brass combination dial and a heavy spoked wheel. It was a vault designed to withstand a bomb blast, hidden perfectly beneath the floorboards of a rotting cabin in the woods. And as Clara stepped closer, her trembling hand reaching out to touch the cold steel of the wheel, she noticed something even more impossible. The green LED light on the electronic bypass scanner next to the dial was actively blinking. The vault had power. Clara stood frozen before the massive stainless steel door, the green LED light casting an eerie, emerald glow across her pale face. The sheer impossibility of the situation anchored her feet to the concrete floor. Great-Aunt Sylvia, a woman remembered only for her brittle bones and endless collection of moth-eaten cardigans, possessed a subterranean fortress. The electronic keypad adjacent to the heavy-spoked wheel demanded a 6-digit code. Clara had no code, no key, and no idea where to begin. Retreating up the spiral stone staircase, Clara re-entered the freezing study. The blizzard outside howled with renewed fury, violently rattling the window panes, but she barely registered the cold. Her mind was entirely consumed by the puzzle beneath her feet. She grabbed her flashlight and began tearing through the room. She pulled the rotting encyclopedias off the shelves, frantically checking for hollowed-out compartments. She ripped the drawers out of the heavy oak desk, finding nothing but dried inkwells and rusted paperclips. Desperation began to set in, until her beam caught the gleam of brass on the top shelf. It was one of the archaic mechanical clocks, a heavy, ornate carriage clock that looked completely out of place among the decaying books. Clara carefully pulled it down, wiping away a thick layer of dust. The clock's hands were permanently frozen at exactly 4:15. She turned it over, inspecting the heavy brass casing. The winding key was missing, but the back panel had a microscopic, nearly invisible seam. Using the edge of her frozen thumbnail, Clara pried at the seam. With a sharp click, the brass plate popped open. Inside, nestled among the dormant gears, was a small, black USB security token and a heavily yellowed index card. Written on the card in elegant, sweeping cursive were 6 numbers, 041588. Clara's breath hitched. April 15th, 1988. It was the exact date her mother, Sylvia's only niece, had almost died in a devastating car accident, the event that had triggered the family's lifelong avalanche of medical debt. Armed with the token and the code, Clara practically flew down the stone steps. Her trembling hands approached the keypad. She plugged the USB token into a hidden port beneath the LED scanner and punched in the 6 digits, 041588. The scanner beeped a sharp, piercing note. The LED turned from green to a solid, vibrant blue. Deep within the steel door, a series of heavy mechanical tumblers began to violently clank and disengage, the sound echoing loudly off the concrete walls. Clara gripped the heavy spoked wheel and turned it counterclockwise. The sheer weight of the door required her entire body's momentum. But eventually, the seal broke with a loud hiss of pressurized air. She pulled the vault door open and shined her flashlight into the cavernous space. It was not a tomb, and it was not a treasure room. It was a fully functional, climate-controlled server farm and archives center. Rows of towering black server racks hummed with quiet, efficient power, their blue indicator lights blinking in rhythmic synchronization. Thick cables snaked across the immaculate, epoxy-coated floor, leading to an industrial backup generator in the corner. But it was the far wall that truly stole Clara's breath. Stacked neatly on reinforced steel shelving were dozens of heavy aluminum briefcases and rows of meticulous leather-bound ledgers. Clara approached the nearest shelf and unlatched one of the silver briefcases. Inside, bound in crisp, uncirculated bands, were stacks of $100 bills. A conservative estimate put the single case at over $2 million. There were 20 cases just like it. However, the true danger of the vault was not the currency. It was the paper trail. Clara pulled one of the heavy, leather-bound ledgers from the shelf and opened it beneath her flashlight beam. The pages were filled with Sylvia's immaculate handwriting, detailing complex webs of shell companies, offshore accounts, and wire transfers. As Clara turned the pages, her heart pounded against her ribs. She recognized the terminology immediately. It was the exact same dark money laundering architecture that she had been investigating and ultimately framed for at Gallagher and Company. Sylvia Pembroke had not been a lonely spinster. She had been the phantom architect, the master accountant for an elite syndicate of corrupt politicians, corporate titans, and criminal enterprises. Clara pulled a grey filing box from a lower shelf, her eyes scanning the tabs. The names listed on the manila folders read like a roster of global power brokers. There was Senator Richard Croft, the vocal proponent of domestic tax reform, tied directly to a massive Cayman Islands slush fund. There was CEO David Kensington, a pioneer in green energy whose accounts showed direct financing of illegal logging operations in the Amazon. And then, near the back of the box, Clara found the folder that made her blood run cold. The tab simply read, Gallagher and Company, Internal Operations. She ripped the folder open. Inside were the true, unredacted records of the firm's offshore allocations, spanning 2 decades. Arthur Pendleton's signature was everywhere, explicitly authorizing the illegal transfers. But more damning was the direct communication log between Arthur and Richard Gregory. Richard had not only approved the theft of client funds, but he had actively orchestrated it. There were even contingency plans detailing exactly how to frame junior analysts if the SEC ever initiated an audit. Her own name, Clara Mitchell, was highlighted in yellow on a document dated 6 months prior. They had planned to destroy her life long before the audit ever began. Clara collapsed into a rolling office chair, sitting in the center of the vault. The gravity of her discovery was crushing. She held the ultimate leverage over the most powerful men in Boston. But as the humming of the servers filled the silence, a terrifying realization washed over her. Sylvia was dead. The massive amounts of cash and the active servers indicated that the syndicate still used this network. They still needed these files, and they would inevitably send someone to collect them. The blizzard raged for 3 unbroken days, burying the Pembroke cottage under 5 feet of snow and severing the property entirely from the outside world. Clara barely slept. She spent every waking hour inside the subterranean vault, utilizing the facility's satellite internet uplink to systematically decode, copy, and organize the decades of damning evidence. She worked with the cold, calculated precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose. By the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke, leaving a chilling, absolute silence in its wake. The sky was a hard, cloudless blue. Clara was at the vault's central terminal, finishing the encryption of a massive data packet containing the Gallagher and Company files, when the proximity alarm on the control panel flashed bright red. Motion sensors, discreetly hidden in the dead pine trees outside the cabin, had been tripped. Clara switched the terminal's monitor to the exterior security feed. A heavy, matte black snowcat vehicle was aggressively carving its way up the unplowed driveway, its treads crushing the rusted iron gates into the snow. The vehicle skidded to a halt near the porch. 2 men stepped out. They were heavily armed, wearing tactical winter gear and completely devoid of law enforcement insignia. Clara recognized the taller of the two immediately from her days at the firm. Jonathan Vance, a private security consultant on Richard Gregory's direct payroll. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to sanitize the site. Panic surged through Clara's veins, but she forced it down. She had a tactical advantage they were unaware of. She quickly typed a series of commands into the terminal. She set the encrypted data packet, containing the financial ruin of Senator Croft, CEO Kensington, and Richard Gregory, to automatically transmit to the encrypted tip lines of the FBI, the SEC, and 5 major international news outlets. A progress bar appeared on the screen. Upload 10%. Above her, the floorboards vibrated violently as the front door of the cottage was kicked off its hinges. Heavy boots thundered across the living room. "Check the bedrooms," Jonathan's muffled voice barked through the ceiling. "Pendleton said the old woman kept the primary ledger in the study. Rip the walls open if you have to." Clara watched the progress bar. Upload 35%. She could hear them tearing the house apart, smashing furniture and ripping down the decaying wallpaper. It was only a matter of time before they discovered the study and the unnatural hollow echo of the floorboards. She grabbed a heavy steel wrench from the server rack and backed into the darkest corner of the vault, her eyes locked on the monitor. Upload 60%. A massive crash echoed directly above her head. They had found the study. A moment later, Clara heard the distinct sound of a crowbar tearing into the heavy oak planks. "Hey, Vance, over here," the second man yelled. "There's a subfloor. It's a steel hatch." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched the monitor as the progress bar slowly crawled forward. The internet uplink was routing through multiple proxies to hide the source, making the transfer agonizingly slow. Upload 85%. "Blow the lock," Jonathan ordered. Clara scrambled to the heavy vault door. She couldn't let them in before the upload finished. She grabbed the spoked wheel and pulled the massive stainless steel door shut, engaging the interior mechanical locks. The heavy steel tumblers slammed into place, sealing her inside the subterranean bunker just as a deafening explosion rocked the ceiling above. Concrete dust rained down on the servers as the mercenaries blew the trap door open. Upload 95%. Heavy boots pounded down the spiral stone staircase. Through the thick steel of the vault door, Clara could hear Jonathan cursing violently as he realized he was locked out. "Drill it! Get the thermite!" he screamed, pounding his fists against the impenetrable steel. Clara stood in front of the terminal, holding her breath, her eyes locked on the flashing green text. Upload 100%. Transmission complete. Clara let out a long, ragged exhale, sinking into the office chair. It was done. The digital bombs had been dropped. Within minutes, federal servers would be flashing red. Newsrooms across the globe would be scrambling to verify the biggest financial leak in modern history. She didn't have to wait long. Less than 45 minutes later, the chaotic sounds of drilling outside the vault door abruptly stopped. Through the exterior security cameras, Clara watched as 2 heavily armored FBI tactical helicopters descended upon the clearing, the intense downdraft whipping the snow into a blinding frenzy. Dozens of federal agents swarmed the property, swiftly disarming and arresting Jonathan and his partner. When the local authorities finally managed to bypass the electronic lock and open the vault door hours later, they found Clara Mitchell sitting calmly at the desk, sipping a bottle of water she had found in emergency supplies. She handed the lead investigator the master encryption key, cementing her status not as a disgraced analyst, but as the most crucial federal whistleblower of the decade. 3 months later, Richard Gregory and Arthur Pendleton were indicted on 74 counts of federal fraud and racketeering. The syndicate collapsed overnight. Clara was completely exonerated. Furthermore, because the millions in physical cash were legally housed on her inherited property and unconnected to any specific federal crime trace, skilled lawyers secured her a massive percentage of the seized assets as a whistleblower reward. Clara never returned to corporate finance. She had seen enough of the darkness hidden behind glass skylines. Instead, she rebuilt the Oakhaven cottage into a sprawling, modern mountain estate, a permanent monument to the woman who fired her on Christmas Eve, completely unaware that she had just handed Clara the keys to the kingdom. This incredible twist of fate proves that rock bottom can sometimes hide the greatest opportunities imaginable. If Clara's brilliant revenge and shocking discovery kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to share this thrilling story with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more insane, real-life drama and hidden mysteries. Comment below what you would have done if you found a secret vault under your floorboards.